everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Public History and Arts. My name is Myriam, her name is Nada, and today we have a very special guest, Cassandra Marsillo. Hi, Cassandra.
Hello.
Hello. So I'm gonna read a small intro for those of you who don't know Cassandra, and then we could start the conversation together. So Cassandra is a public historian, artist, and writer based in Tiohtià, Montreal, telling and listening to stories about immigration, identity, collective memory, food, and folklore, particularly in relation to the Italian-Canadian experience and traditions from her family's region, Molise. You chose every medium that is like you chose the best in the world. Just
I know.
saying, like, and I'm so excited that we have you today to talk about a lot of stuff that are interesting for us to learn about in public history and arts, and because you have this amazing profile that is both worlds. Like you're the first invitee that we have that plays on both equally, and I'm really excited about this. So thank you for joining us, Cassandra.
I'm so excited.
Okay, do I shoot now?
Like,
I guess I do. Okay, so Cassandra, the Yellow Line, a fantastic project that is both about a physical but also a metaphorical line separating like two worlds almost. When you, as like a public historian or someone working with public history, when you listen to stories and later when you start telling these stories or narrate them, how do you anchor your stories, or like which line do you abide by, the metaphorical one or the physical one? And also, like, what is the line between the physical line and the metaphorical one?
First of all, I'm obsessed with all your questions. Like they're so good. And this one's great because the idea started with a physical yellow line, right? A yellow line that went through my playground of my school, where I was at an English school, and on the other side of the yellow line was the playground of the French school. So I don't know how much I have to get into like the
As much
background.
as you want.
The historic tensions between English and French in Quebec. And the way I was looking at that yellow line, because realizing that it was kind of like a particular experience, that we could not cross that line. Like we had lunch monitors that would patrol that line because, I mean, obviously they wanted to not mix up the students, like, because at the end of lunch, you had to be in your line, like to go to school, but also because people would get in fights all the time along that line. And I found that looking back as, then studying history, looking back on that moment so interesting because I was like, none of us were actually English and none of us were actually French, right? In the sense that we all came from like immigrant backgrounds and were placed on either side of this line because of the time when our families came here. And so it all started with that very physical line. And then with other people, the other people that I interviewed, the line became like a metaphor because they didn't actually have to deal with that line in the ground. But metaphorically, they did because there was always this kind of divide in realizing like you are, one of them, you're on the English side of this line, but then realizing like, wait, I'm not actually that, but I'm not French, but I'm not fully Italian, but I'm not this. And so, like, I think a lot of the project was around the metaphor of the line, but it started very much anchored in that physical, and it allowed me to have very interesting conversations with the narrators of the project because kind of went in and started with my story. And I was like, this was my experience, and this is what I realized later in my life. And then they came in and said how they felt that they had that yellow line metaphorically in some ways in their lives as well.
Perfect. And this gives us like a background, and everyone who's listening and who's not yet familiar with the yellow line now, like they have an idea what we're talking about.
Yeah,
Myriam?
I could say a bit more. It really was about like um, language and education and identity, and navigating, like you're kind of forced to navigate this binary here. Like it's, been called the bicultural, bilingual narrative of French and English. But my argument with that piece was that that doesn't actually exist in a real, like comfortable way in many people's lived experiences. And so when dealing with education and kind of like the choices that people either had to make or were forced to make, because, a lot of the Italian community, this is, you know what, I'm going to answer this in another question because you bring it up, you bring it up in another question,
Okay.
and I'm going to go a bit more in depth in this narrative. So go ahead.
Okay, perfect.
Sure. And just so you know, Cassandra, although my editing skills are not that high, but we're gonna try and include during this conversation snippets and pictures from the works that you've provided us with, so that our viewers could also have an idea of what it looks
Sure.
like, where it was exhibited, how did it look like, so that they could engage with what you're saying more.
Sure.
But maybe I could take like a step back and
Yeah.
start from a question that is like it's a basic question for you, but it's very curious for everyone to know. When you talk about yourself, you say you're an art historian, which I love the expression. But how did you come about to be both in both worlds equally, and how did it occur to you that you could work at the intersection of public history and arts?
So I started like my parcours started in arts actually. So my first degree was a Bachelor of Fine Arts, and when I went to university to study fine arts, is when I really started to like discover the world of like installation art and like immersive environments. And I think because like I was drawn to that and like world building in that sense, and using autobiography, using story in order to ask questions about like memory and like telling stories in my art. Once I went into history, because honest, I went into history because I was like, oh, I'm gonna teach history in high school. That was the plan after my arts degree. And I discovered, for better or for worse, I discovered public history, which I didn't know about before. And when I started learning about public history, I was like, oh my God, I was doing this. Like, I was kind of doing this in a way, in my previous work. And it just made so much sense. Like, the questions I was asking in my art practice were questions that I could ask in a similar way in public history. And like methods I was using in my art practice were methods I could use in public history. And like a lot of people, questioned me in a sense of like, how do you go from art to history? And I'm like, how do you not? It's like, it's the same thing. No, but obviously there's different methodologies, et cetera, et cetera. But there were so many links between what I was doing and then what I was learning. And like the title of art historian just kind of came out of that. It was like the era of, Blogspot and like Tumblr and stuff. So I was like, okay, I'm going to start a blog and write about all these things. And so it kind of came out of that, and then it stuck because I thought it was just so perfect. And it was a way for me, like obviously then going, finishing the bachelor's in history and then doing a master's in history, all those kind of like artistic practices that I had learned and had loved, kind of fell to the side because you have to write papers, you have to read 700 books. Like, I don't have time to make a painting, And it was kind of like also a little anchor for me, that word art historian, and a reminder that like you got to get back to this at some point. And so that's what I've been trying to do now.
It's really nice the way you put it. And I think it also speaks to a lot of practitioners in public history because the practice itself hasn't been there for very, very long. And a lot of people outside of the either the US or the Canadian circles don't call it public history. Like people have been
Mhm.
doing it for so long, we just didn't call
Mhm.
it this way. And once you find out that your work can fit into this, you're like, "Oh, my whole life makes sense." And I do like
Yeah.
I connect with what you said about it is there's a lot of difference between public history practices and artistic practice, but they have so much in common for the people who started experimenting by doing. This is where they find
Hmm.
out, oh, this means this. This is what I did. This is what makes sense. This is why I did it. And like, this is why I used this medium. So it's really encouraging for you to say this because for the viewers who are watching us who can't find their way between public history and arts, you don't have to.
You don't have to. Yeah.
I mean, I could use this question as a segue to like thinking of how you think of like art and history already like emphasizes how you work within your project, like how you reject labels and categorizations. And this takes me to ask about like how were you able to avoid these categorizations and labels when you're talking about binaries that are by definition labels and categories. And that's when we're talking about like French and English or Italian and Canadian or like many other things that like came up when we're talking right now, or like that we can see clearly or less clearly when we're reading the project and looking at the pictures.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a way, just talking to people dissolves those boundaries. And like I couldn't put things in any binary or like it's exactly this or exactly that because no one had that understanding of themselves, right? And so um by actually then I think this is like the power of oral history too, is like when you speak to, and I mean, it was a master's project, so it's not like I interviewed 20 people. I interviewed 6 people. So it's not, like this comprehensive story of experience at the time, but just talking to 6 different people and letting the story, I think it was important for me to not focus only on the moment of like being rejected from a French school. That was kind of like where the idea came from, was there's this story that I'll talk about a bit more in another question. um, how Italians and other immigrant groups were rejected from French schools before Bill 101, a law was put into place that like then if you came from in the 70s, if you came from an your parents were like immigrants, you had to go to a French school. So like that changed after. It was important to me for me to talk about, yes, that moment, but beyond it too, right? Because that's then when you get all the complexities of like, how do I see myself as a person and like, how do I understand my identity? And it never fits in one place or another. Like it's a third here, like, a quarter there. Like, and it's not even evenly measured in that way. It's just kind of this nebulous thing, right? Of trying to understand. And so, and then also talking to the 6 different people, you know, when you're thinking of going in and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go in, I'm going to get these testimonies of, why they were rejected from these schools, or there's like a systematic approach of why they were rejected. And that wasn't true either. And so even there, you can't create a category of like these people were rejected because they were Italian. Like even there were so much variety between the 6 experiences that I couldn't even outright say that, right? So it's just like just talking to people, talking to people and letting them tell their point of view and their perspective of that moment and of their lives and how they feel about themselves, their identity, and their community identity, you realize that it's just like you can't, there's no straight lines anymore. It's like squiggles, you know?
I think it's very nice what you're saying about like how people see themselves, that people don't see themselves in like closed boxes or something.
Mhm.
Like like the creation of identity and how identity is experienced is more of a fluid experience rather than like one thing or the other. Because I think especially now at times when people can be like prosecuted and harassed for being one thing and not the other, it makes like a whole different experience if you say, but you can't and you shouldn't be
Mhm.
one thing or the other. So I really
Mhm.
like that.
Yeah, and building on that maybe and on how your work questions and presents the different layers of identities and the different manifestations of these identities. How do you work about your mediums depending on this discourse? When do you, because you were talking, you like you're an artist, so you've seen installations, you've seen immersive art, you've experimented with culinary arts, you're literally in every medium. How do you choose your mediums and how do you mirror that with the context of what you're saying?
Mhm. I mean, I think being in such like open environments of like wherever I went to school, like whether it was Concordia or Carleton, in the public history departments, there was such an openness to kind of like do what you think feels right for this project. And so having that environment then like allows you to always, I don't know, like practice your creativity. And so then even when you leave and you're, you know, on your own in the world without the support of your little department, yeah, um, you could say like, okay, well, there are so many possibilities and there's so many also just like DIY methods. Like you learn from, there's so many people doing amazing, amazing public history work, like artists doing amazing public history work. And you know, what's nice when you're in an academic department is like, oh, you get funding to do a project. So like when I was doing my master's and I wasn't sure how I was going to, you know, show the results of my work, whether it was going to be a paper or I don't know, like a zine or or a video. I fell upon the exhibit because I liked the idea of the immersive environment in that case with the oral histories. And because there, since we were taught navigating so many different spaces, like it wasn't just about the school and the schoolyard for me, but then people brought up their homes and people brought up like the outside, being outside and the outside spaces. And so I wanted to bring that into the display of the work. And so the exhibit was like, you know, conceptually, like a living room, a school room, a classroom, and a backyard that kind of just like flowed into each other with elements hinting at that, right? And that felt like it just made sense for that project, and like I had the funding to do it. But now I don't have the funding to do something of that size. And so then you start thinking, okay, what are other ways? And so for projects that I'm thinking of doing now, where, for example, the a project on the Italian birthday cake, the history of this cake, where did it come from? What does it mean to the community? I'm thinking like, oh, well, I could do a zine, right? And collect stories and do some kind of more DIY project that doesn't require me to rent a space and like buy stuff to fill it, right? And so there's that aspect as well, of course, is we always got to deal with the financial aspect of it. But then it's also the research and like doing the oral histories, like based on what is coming out of those stories. I feel like, you know, you go into a project with an idea and then you start talking to people and you're like, oh, wait a minute. And that's when things start to click, is once you start doing those interviews and speaking to people and hearing the stories, hearing the spaces they evoke, the memories they evoke, and then you start imagining how those could look and in what format they could exist in. Because you could always decide different things, you know?
And I think it's also really nice and sane for us to accept in the academic world that things do not have to be planned from the beginning. You're
Yeah.
working with people and you're like, all you say in your proposal is like co-production. Okay, embrace co-production. If people want to
Yeah.
see this differently, embrace it. If people don't like or don't understand what you're presenting in your artwork and go like, I didn't get it. I would have gotten
Yeah.
it if you made 1, 2, 3. Then just give it space to be built with people. And you just said it
Yeah.
your like yourself when you were doing the oral histories. It was these testimonies that were shaping the project with you because people in their stories also have agency. Like if they're telling you that I really like to see this in such and such settings, you cannot ignore this and go like, no, but my proposal for this research included only this. But like
Yeah.
it's also something that we still need to push for in academia and embrace more. We're lucky to have it a bit more on the public history side and depending on the context, but we definitely need to do a lot more work in that area.
Yeah. And I think, you know, another thing that actually now your follow-up brought up in my mind was when I was doing interviews with people, they were also pulling up like objects and photos, right? And so then it's like these are like props and for them to like tell their story and like evidence too for them, right, of their story. And clearly that was important to them. And so then you see that and you're like, okay, how could I incorporate these in some way if that's what they want and if that's how they want to show. So in the exhibit where we had like the classroom setting, everyone had a desk and they wrote their own bio on the desk to describe who they were. And so that was interesting too, because you saw that they describe themselves in very different ways. Um, and they emphasize different aspects of their identity. And they chose what went into their desk to represent their story and then who they are. So that came out of the interviews too. Like I wouldn't have thought of that otherwise.
I mean, I think your answer and Miriam's follow-up like make me want to ask so many more questions. So I actually don't know like if I can take like a step back, go back to when you were talking about like the actual conceptual space with the classroom and the living room and the backyard, and just think about spaces as spaces. Like when we think of like poetics of like a certain given space, and like in your case, we're talking about like liminal spaces that are also spaces of confrontation, I'd say.
Mm.
But then I also think of your position as, or like the space that you claim as a narrator or an author who's giving uh, uh, a space for all these different stories and histories, which is like, you know, histoire in the double meaning in French,
Mhm.
to coexist and intersect with one another. And I'm thinking that like just by claiming this space and creating or affording this space to others, you're already like taking like not a side, but you're getting a position. Like you
Yeah.
have the authority to narrate that. And I wanted you to tell us more about like how was your like your approach when you were conducting the yellow line to just sustain this I mean, inclusive is not a very accurate word, but like this space that is embracing all the different histories and stories, and allowing the re-narration to be performed without
Mm.
it being one thing or another.
Mhm.
Does it make any sense? Like I feel like I'm going all over the place.
No, I think, and if my answer is not responding to you, then just stop me and and
Yeah, I mean,
we'll
like let's see
redirect.
where this goes.
Um, I mean, I think, you know, first of all, the project in and of itself was a response to a narrative that exists in like in Quebec history, where um that like the Italians and other immigrants were not rejected from French schools. They chose to go to English schools because English schools, they would learn English, and that's like quote unquote the better language to learn, right? Um, and so there was already kind of like a challenging of that, like, no, this actually happened. But yes, also people probably did choose in some other cases English schools. Like it doesn't have to be one or the other. So I think that was like important for me too. And when I started this project, there was some pushback by people being like, but why are you like trying to like demonize the French schools? I'm like, I'm not. This is just something that happened. This is some, that's it. It happened. And it's been neglected and been like it's been called false actually. And so it was important for me in that sense because that's also like the overarching kind of narrative that we're dealing with of like not allowing these narratives to coexist, even though they could have, right? Um, and I mean, this is such a great question because honestly, I feel like even when I finished my thesis, I was like struggling with how to put myself back in it. Like it was interesting because the whole thing started with like my personal story of the yellow line, right? And then I got all these other stories, and then I was like, how do I fit back into this now, right? Because exactly, I want to recognize that I'm I'm a part of this story, and there's like my hand throughout the project, right? So you want to be like transparent about that. And I don't know if I like succeeded in re-injecting myself in it or not, but I think the best answer to your question is like what happened on opening night of this project. And that was, so we were in the exhibit space. The oral histories were on overhead speakers, but there were a lot of people there, so you couldn't hear them that well, but all the narrators were there. And they started bringing people on tours of the exhibit themselves, like totally unprompted. I did not ask them to do that. And they started to bring people around and re-narrating the stories in that space all at the same time. And I was like, this is so cool. And so I feel like that moment was almost even beside like that moment and being there with the six people that participated in the project, that was actually the success of the project, not the exhibit in and of itself. It was that moment when we were all there and able to like overlap, tell the stories while the stories were on display and while the stories were playing overhead, and then we're telling other stories, and it was amazing.
Sounds amazing. It
I don't know
it
if I
sounds
answered
really
your
amazing. Yeah,
question.
you did. You did.
Okay.
Yeah, and more. Yeah.
I think what you just spoke about, this tension between am I myself in the project or am I a mirror to other people's story in the project, is something that defines the tension between the artist and the historian. Because
Mm,
for us coming from arts, it's always, I think it's very natural. Like it's always a story that connects to us, speaks to us, and
mhm.
then we want to show it to the world. Whereas for the historian, they want to stay on the like the impartial line where they present other people's narratives.
Which doesn't
And
exist. Let's be
what,
honest.
yeah, and it's like it's always this balance that's really difficult to make when you're presenting a project. You started from a point of, I want to talk about this because it happened to me and I'm sure it happened to someone else. But then when you're presenting it, you melt into it. You're like you're one voice of many others. This is beautiful. But it's also challenging. Like, how do you go about going into academia, going out of academia? When do you present your work and challenge academia? When do you stand on the side and go like, no, I'm an artist, go to hell?
Oh my God. Another great question. And I want to, like also preface this by saying like reiterating what I said before that I was super lucky to be in extremely open academic settings. Like the world was our oyster, right? Like as long as it made sense in some way and we were doing work, like they let us do it. And I had a supervisor for my master's that was amazing. Like he was just like, yeah, go ahead. I'm gonna support you. I'm here. I'm supporting you. Like just such a great, we're gonna shout out to John Walsh. We always have to shout him out. He was such a great supervisor and he really like just let me run with my ideas. And so in that sense, I never felt as much the pushback in academia than maybe I might have felt had I been in like, and we never know like when we're when we're in public history, we never know what to call, history, the history department. People are like, oh, the straight history department, the regular history department. We're all doing history, but maybe I would have felt more pushback had I been in the history department instead of the public history department, right? And so the way I kind of make decisions about how my work will kind of manifest is more like the way I had mentioned before, in collaborating with people and talking with people in wherever kind of the narrative goes or like when inspiration hits. And like there's sometimes when I'm in a phase where it's like all I want to do is draw and like all I want to do is embroider and that's what I'm gonna do. Which again, when you're not in when you're not on the deadlines of academia, I think that's more the constraint is like, oh, I have to read these 3 books this week, and so I don't have time. And so you have to you're forced to kind of make those decisions of putting aside your artistic practice. But like I mean, I had profs in at Carleton that were like, if you don't want to write an essay, you can make an art project and we'll have a discussion, and that's your final project. And so I never had to kind of be like, I'm doing an art project. Like they let us do it. So we need more of that. Like follow that lead.
I mean, lucky you. I
Yeah.
kind of like envy you right now, like being in a PhD program myself. But but lucky you. Like I'm happy that this is how you experienced academia because then that's how we get to have like cool projects like your project. And I'm sure like what's coming next is going to always be influenced and shaped by like this free and open way of thinking about like art and history. I don't
Mhm.
want to be taking too much time, Miriam. Like I can either ask one more like final question or I can shut up. I can go ahead. Okay, thank you. Okay. So I mean it's again it's a follow-up question and it's also a way of like wrapping up what we have been discussing. And in your answer to Miriam, you were talking about like identity and agency. And like in your project we read like how you think of memory as a performance, which like reiterate and reemphasize this idea that history is a narrative. Like it's not as rigorous and set in stone as some people like to think of it. Like this is history, yeah, it's one narrative of history, which brings to mind like identity and agency as concepts that also people think of as like it's this one thing, but it's not. It's like contingent on like the mainstream narrative and discourse and what you grew up with and what you learned. So my question would be like, how do you think and you already answered that like partially when like throughout the conversation, but how do you see that public history is actually not only allowing this temporary space for changing the narrative or like having access to the different narrative, And like, how does it push the general consensus about what history is and what a narrative is?
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is exactly what drew me to public history, was how it does all that, right? Um, and just thinking of the kind of memory as performance and like identity as performance, like thinking of that yellow line and the fights that would break out across it, like that was all performance of historical memory, of a tension between like two colonial powers that none of us came from, you know what I mean? And we were performing that like without understanding that that's what we were doing, right? Because we we were taught one narrative of history in the English school, and in the French school is like another narrative. And like we then brought that to the playground, which like had nothing really to do with us. So it's so like even that is public history, right? Like the history that you're taught as a child in school. This is like government public history, right? The curriculum is provincially based. And so even that has an influence on you. And so I think what what I love about public history, and I'm checking the time to make sure I answer this question in the time. What I love about public history is that it asks us to be like self-conscious, self-reflective, about the narratives that we are consuming. And it asks us to ask questions about the narratives we're consuming and be like critical and analytical and have discussions of the narratives that we're always consuming. Like that is, and like that's what we should be doing in history anyway. But because the way we're taught history is like memorize this, memorize that, by the time you hit university, that all falls apart because they're like, no, that's not what history is. And then you have to kind of like learn, relearn it again because you're like, oh, I never thought that I had to have like a perspective or was going to be asked my perspective or was going to be asked my interpretation. Whereas public history, that's like off the bat, right? Like, how are you engaging with this? How are you engaging with the people around you? Like, how are your narratives like clashing or coming together with others around you? So I'll wrap it up there just because we're running out of time, but
That's a beautiful way to end this interview. We're so lucky with the ending of the interviews. They're always so beautiful. I'm like, mwah. I think this speaks a lot about why we're doing this series today, why public history is needed more than ever today to talk about the multiple layers of identities, the multiple interpretations of the past, the multiple narratives that can coexist in every country, in every continent, and anywhere around the world. Thank you so much, Cassandra, for being our guest, for speaking about this, and for teaching us about your work, and also giving us the space to connect all of these lines. This was such an interesting conversation, and I'm so happy and glad that we had the time to do it. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're gonna post this online with some links for you to follow Cassandra's work online if you want to see it, and also to have a bit more info about the upcoming events that she's preparing, all exciting stuff. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.